Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Colorado Springs. It's wonderful to be here. You have a beautiful campus in a really beautiful part of the country. I had some really great talks today with students. I think a bunch of them are here tonight, in which we basically figured out the solutions to all the problems that I'll be talking about tonight. Had a great talk with Chancellor Reddy, and I think I'm talking about some problems that are common on campuses. I think things are better here. My guess is I'll poll the students later. But my guess is that they'll recognize the problems, but that it'll be not as bad as it is in some other places. In other words, I think things are really hopeful here. I think there's a lot of goodwill among the students, among the administrators. So I think this campus in particular is going to do well, and I think it's going to come through this difficult period. Now, I'll be talking about universities, but it turns out the problem is much bigger than that. It's connected to many other institutions. And so even if you don't care about universities, if you care about children, education, democracy, or business, this talk should be relevant to you. How many of you care about any of those things? Raise your hand. Okay. All right. So I think I'll have something for everyone here tonight. So I find that in thinking about any institution, if you specify up front what its telos is. Telos is the Greek word that Aristotle and others used to define the end or purpose of something. And if you keep that in mind, then it really helps you understand where it's going wrong and how to set it right. So, for example, the telos of a knife is to cut. And if someone says, I have a knife here, it's a really great knife, can't cut anything, but it's a really, really good knife, you might say, well, you've misunderstood what a knife is. It's not a really good knife. Or if someone says, I have a friend who's a doctor, and she's a fantastic doctor. She can't heal anybody, but she's great. Okay, you'd say, well, no. The telos of a doctor is to heal, it's health. So what is the telos of a university? Well, we have this image of ourselves. This is Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, with Plato and Aristotle in the center. And there's a lot of activity there, right? Are they fighting? Are they playing? They're disputing, they're talking, they're presenting arguments and then receiving counter-arguments. That's how we do our work in the academy. And it's all in service of what? What is our telos? Just call it out if you guess. What's the telos of a university? Okay, great. Truth. It's right there on the crest of many of our top universities. Truth. Veritas, or light, which is a sort of a stand-in for truth. Many of you from my generation remember the fictional Faber College. What was its motto from Animal House? Knowledge is good. So we have this idea of universities that they produce knowledge, they find truth, and then they pass it on along with the skills to find truth yourself as a student. And this university is no exception. The motto of the whole University of Colorado system is let your light shine. So again, this metaphor of light, truth, discovery. There's also, along with this, a self-image of fearlessness. Our heroes are fearless. They will follow the truth wherever it may lead, as Thomas Jefferson said about the University of Virginia, where I taught for 17 years. We'll follow it wherever it may lead, and we will tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. This is our image of ourselves. We are fearless. We are bold. Well, that all began to change in 2014, and so here's the story of how it changed. My friend Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and he's always been subject to depression. He's prone to depression, and in 2007, he had his most serious episode ever. He made very specific plans to kill himself. And at the last second, before he was going to do it, he lost his nerve, or whatever you would say about that, and he called 911, and they talked him into calling a hospital. They sent a car for him, and they got him to check himself into a hospital. When he was in the hospital, or rather, after he was discharged, I should say, he learned cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very powerful, easy technique. You learn to retrain your thoughts. And the key to it is that you learn to recognize the distortions, the cognitive distortions that we all do sometimes, but that depressed and anxious people do a lot. So catastrophizing, everything's going to go terribly and it's going to be a disaster. Black and white thinking, overgeneralizing. These are basically bad thinking, the sorts of errors we'd want to weed out of anybody. And so Greg learned how to weed it out of his own thinking. That's what CBT is. He goes back to his job at Fire, Now, all of his work has been pushing back against administrators. It was always administrators who were restricting students' speech rights, never the students. It was always administrators who said, you know, you can't say that, shut down this publication, we could get in trouble for it. But suddenly, from out of nowhere, around 2013, 2014, Greg starts seeing episodes in which the students themselves are trying to censor speech or protect themselves, as they said, from speakers or books or ideas. And so this is something new under the sun. He'd never seen it. So Greg invites me to lunch in May of 2014 because my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, had talked about CBT, and so he wanted to talk to me about it. And he told me his idea, which is this weird stuff is happening. Somehow, colleges are teaching students to think in this distorted way. And if we're teaching them to think in this distorted way, aren't we going to make them depressed? Well, I thought this was a brilliant idea, because I had just begun to see this at NYU among students there. And so some strange things had been happening on campus, and I was reading about other things all around the country, and I thought this was just a brilliant diagnosis. So I said it was a great idea, you should write it up, and I volunteered myself as a co-author, and he accepted my self-volunteering, and we wrote it up as an article that was eventually published in The Atlantic in 2015. Now, the kinds of things that Greg was seeing, and that I began to see once I talked with him, were that from out of nowhere, students in 2014 began asking for trigger warnings. If a book is going to be assigned that has some upsetting content, students wanted to be warned before a book like Greek mythology or something would be assigned. Students were shutting down, shouting down speakers, disinviting speakers who didn't fit their ideas of a certain kind of political view. And they were asking for safe spaces. This was a term that, of course, many of us remember from Bosnia in the 1990s. But a safe space would be a place where you wouldn't be criticized, ideas wouldn't be criticized, you could speak without having people challenge you. Also, it was a place where if a disturbing speaker was coming to campus, as happened at Brown University, it wasn't really a disturbing speaker, it was a debate between two feminists, one of whom argued that America is a rape culture, the other argued that America is not a rape culture. Perfectly good thing to debate, but some students thought that we shouldn't allow someone to come onto campus and say that it's not a rape culture, because this could be invalidating to some women who had been victims of sexual assault and who believed that America is a rape culture. So they shouldn't have to suffer someone challenging their belief. And when the university president would not shut down the talk, the students went and created a space for these students who would be upset by this, that had various ways to comfort and soothe them from their upset. Now again, they don't have to go to the talk, but it was thought to be dangerous to them. This was the kind of distortion that Greg was seeing. So our article comes out in August of 2015. There's a lot of discussion around it. A lot of people say that we're catastrophizing, that we're overgeneralizing from a few incidents, a dozen famous episodes on campus in the previous year. And so we have this interesting discussion about it. And then at Halloween that year at Yale, all hell breaks loose. There was a conflict over Halloween costumes. Now, nobody actually wore an offensive costume, but there was a big argument over whether the university can tell students what to wear. It escalated into gigantic protests. Students marched to the president's office. They gave him a list of many, many demands. He had to remake Yale. They gave him 1 week. They gave him an ultimatum. Give us your response in 1 week or else. And so he meets the ultimatum. And he gives them as much as he can. He tries to meet as many of the demands as he possibly can. And this is a smashing success, such a big success that now the protests go national. And at more than 80 universities within the next few months, similar marches, similar demands to remake the university, including many mandatory courses in certain ways of thinking, restrictions on speech, all sorts of changes that would make it very difficult to do our work. The episodes begin often with racial protests and demands about racial justice, but they quickly morph into just all kinds of demands. So at Oberlin, for example, there was a protest over banh mi, the Vietnamese food in the cafeteria. It wasn't authentic enough. It was, so it becomes almost anything. A professor here at the University of Northern Colorado assigned our article to his class to test out, is it really true that students can't talk about controversial things anymore? So he signs our article and lets the students pick the topic. The topic they pick is transgender. So they have a discussion about transgender issues. One student's offended, reports the professor's investigated, his contract is not renewed. So it's just like things are really just going haywire. It's becoming very, very strange in 2016 and into 2017. Once the unexpected election of Donald Trump takes place, passions on campus escalate even further. And it's in this semester that all the violence happens. So I want to be very clear. Things have been very unsettled, but the violence was really limited to a few months in 2017. So the protests at Berkeley, in which a lot of people were injured badly, but nobody was actually killed. Students were involved, but they weren't the main instigators. At Middlebury, when Charles Murray was invited to speak, not about the bell curve, but about his book Coming Apart, students shouted down the talk. When they moved the talk, students found out where the talk was. They attacked Murray and a professor who was interviewing him. They attacked them, injured the professor. She has permanent neck damage. She's retired from teaching. At Evergreen College, a complete meltdown. They took the president essentially hostage, wouldn't let him go to the bathroom, humiliated him. He never challenged their narrative. He never objected. He, again, tried to give the students everything he could possibly give them. So all this was really confined to a few months. Things have settled down since then in that there's no actual violence, but the trends keep moving towards this new regimen around speech and constant conflicts over words, not ideas, over words is what a lot of the conflict is over. So this is the overall thing that we're seeing. The overall thing we're seeing is a complex of ideas. When you see or hear students asking for or asking about, let's see, is that better? Yeah. Safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, saying that speech is violence. This is the whole pattern. At the heart of it is the belief that students are fragile, and therefore, because they're in a dangerous environment, the university is a dangerous place for them. They need to remake it to be a safe place for them. They need protection. So this is what Greg was seeing. This is what we diagnosed, and then it got so much worse after our article came out, and that's why we decided to write it up into a book. And we didn't just take an article and expand it, to fill a book. We really dug deeply into what was happening and why. It was a really fascinating social science mystery. And the diagnosis that we make in the book, we have 6 chapters in the middle that go into 6 causal threads. There's no easy explanation. It's like 6 fuses were lit, and they all came together around 2014, 2015, and boom, we get the implosion of some universities. We get rapid cultural change on many universities. I won't go into this except that the 3 in red I will talk about. What I'm going to do instead of tracing out all the threads is tonight I'm going to focus on 3 really, really bad ideas. 3 ideas that are so terrible that if young people come to believe all 3, we can almost guarantee that they will live unhappy and unsuccessful lives. So it'd be really bad to teach this in college. But unfortunately, in many universities, in many parts of the universities, we do teach these ideas. So let me go through them. So the first, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Now, most of you recognize this is the opposite of Friedrich Nietzsche's famous dictum, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? You've all heard that phrase in some form. And the reason why Nietzsche is correct, the reason why this dictum is true, is the psychological concept of anti-fragility. So this is a wonderful word. This is the most important word I can teach you tonight. You'll find a use for this all over the place. Nassim Taleb, the guy who wrote the book The Black Swan, he's trying to understand systems like the American banking system, which had collapsed in 2008, and he's one of the few people who predicted it, because he said, this whole thing has not been tested, and so if there's any challenge, it's not strong, it's going to collapse, and he was right. So after the financial crisis, he's thinking about this more generally. What's the word for systems that are not fragile, systems that get stronger the more you test them, the more you push them, the more you challenge them? What's the word? And there is no word in the English language. So the word fragility, so like glass is fragile, that's why we don't give it to kids to play with. We don't give kids a wine glass to play with because it'll break. We give them plastic because plastic is resilient. If a kid drops a sippy cup on the ground, it bounces, it doesn't break, but it doesn't get better. So what's the word for a material where the more you drop it, the stronger it gets? And there is no word. It's not resilient. And so Taleb coins the term anti-fragile. So examples of anti-fragility are bones and the immune system. So bones get stronger to the extent that you use them. If you take it easy on your bones, you don't exercise, or you stay in weightlessness for months, your bones will get weak. But the more you bang them around, the more you use them, the stronger they get. The immune system's the best example. Peanut allergies were very rare when I was a kid. The incidence in America has tripled, more than tripled, since the 1990s. Why? Well, it turns out it's only going up in countries that tell women to not eat peanuts while they're lactating. Avoid peanuts because some kids have peanut allergies. Well, it turns out this was exactly the wrong thing to do. And this was proven by a really clever experiment. It's just so straightforward. A group of immunologists recruited about 600 women who had recently given birth and whose kids were at risk of peanut allergy. And there happens to be an Israeli snack food called bamba, which is like a puffed corn, like a Cheeto type thing, but with peanut dust around it, so it tastes like peanut butter. So it's a very easy way to give, even a 2 or 3 month old can eat it and enjoy it and get peanut powder into his mouth. So what they did was they recruited these women and their babies, and these were only women who'd given birth to a kid with eczema or egg allergies or some reason to think that they had an immune issue, an allergy issue, and therefore they were more likely to have peanut allergy. And they told half of them, random assignment, half of them, here's a 5-year supply of bamba. Go feed it to your kid every week, and if the kid doesn't die, come back. And no, I mean obviously they had IRB approval. They were careful. They monitored the kids. But half were told, follow standard advice. Your kid might have a peanut allergy, so don't you go eating any peanuts because the proteins will come through in the milk. So what happens? In the standard condition where women followed standard medical advice, tested at the age of 5, they do a full immunological assay, they look at the immune response, 17% of the kids had a peanut allergy. So for the rest of their lives, every time they go to a restaurant, you've been with people with peanut allergy, it's hard, because it can slip in, they'd have to go to the hospital, so it's really bad. 17% will have to live with that. What happened in the group of kids that ate peanut dust? 3%. Only 3% had a peanut allergy. So we could largely eliminate peanut allergies by doing the opposite of what we've been doing, because the immune system is not fragile, it's anti-fragile. And if you treat an anti-fragile system as though it's fragile, you defeat its developmental plan and you cripple it, which is what we've been doing to our kids' immune systems. All right? Let's rerun that experiment. So this is why the subtitle of our book is How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. So that's a clear example in a biological domain. Now let's look at a psychological domain. So kids are fragile, right? I mean, in some sense they are, but actually kids are anti-fragile. That's the developmental plan that evolution worked out for mammal babies in particular that have to do a lot of brain growth. Kids are anti-fragile, but they sure look fragile when you bring them home from the hospital. And so we protect them. We're afraid for their welfare. We're afraid they're going to bang their heads. We're so careful with them. But if you're always there to protect them, if you protect them, then they don't learn how to protect themselves. And you have to always be there for them. And if you get into this habit in middle childhood, when they forget their backpack, you run to school and you bring the backpack. And then they don't learn to remember the backpack the next day because you're always there picking up for them. And if you are this kind of parent, then it never stops. And you have to be doing it when they're in college, and when they graduate, and when they get their first job, and when they get their first job evaluation. So I teach in a business school, and I now sometimes hear stories of business people who gave a tough evaluation to a young employee, and they got a call from the mother, because it never stops. So this is a really, really bad way to raise kids. And the evidence that we're doing this, the evidence that we're overprotecting our kids and that we didn't always do it, that this is new, can be demonstrated in a very simple way. So clearly we have a bunch of different ages here. We have all different ages here. So I'd like to ask you all, think back to your childhood. And I want to ask you all, at what age were you let out? And that means that you could go out without any adult watching you. You could go to a friend's house, a couple hundred yards away. You and your friend could maybe go down and buy candy or ice cream, or if no sugar is allowed, pizza, whatever. You had some degree of independence. You could play outside, not the backyard, further away. So at what age? So just think of your number. So if that was first grade, you should say 6, okay? So what number? Now, here's how we're going to do it. If you were born before 1982, please raise your hand high. All right, so you are all Gen X or baby boomers. Okay, put your hands down. So just those of you who just raised your hand, I'm going to ask you to just yell out your number. How old were you? I'm going to sweep my finger around. When I point to your section, just yell out the age. What age? Yell it out. Okay, so as you see, there is almost no variance. Almost everybody here said 6, 7, or 8. There were a couple of 5s. I didn't hear anybody say 10. Okay, because even in the 1980s, at the peak of the crime wave, us older folks, we grew up during a gigantic crime wave, to say nothing of the threat of nuclear annihilation. But we were allowed out to play. That's what was always done. And this is what was always done in most other countries that I've been to. Okay? Now I want to ask just those of you who were born after 1995. So if you're Gen Z, born after 1995, raise your hand if you were born after 1995. Raise your hand high. Okay, so just you. I presume most of you are current students here at UCCS. Okay, same thing. I'm going to sweep my finger. Just yell out your number. What's your number? Okay, so I hope you heard it. There's a lot more variance, right? So the mode was 10. That's what I always find. So 5th grade, 6th grade, the mode was now 10, not 6. And I did hear a couple of 6s and 8s, and I heard a couple of 16s. But mostly, this is the norm. We wait until, mostly 5th to 7th grade is when we first let kids out. This is tragic. This is really terrible. Because it's in those years of middle childhood, sort of roughly ages 7 to 12, when kids all over the world take on adventures. The whole point of providing a secure base for your kid is that the kid can now go off and explore and challenge herself and extend her capabilities, and if something goes wrong, she can come back to the secure base. This is the basis of attachment theory. If you keep the kid on the secure base, the kid has no chance to learn. Kids are anti-fragile, and we don't let them develop it if we keep them under our watch. So, all the stories we used to tell about childhood, no more, because, the places you'll go, you might get hurt. Therefore, don't go. Peter Gray is a wonderful psychologist at Boston College. He's one of the country's experts on the psychology of play. All mammals play. It's necessary to wire up the brain. The bigger your brain, the more play you need. Humans need a huge amount of play, and we continue to play into adulthood. What happens then when we deprive kids of free play? What happens? And Gray argues psychopathology, mental illness. Because here are all the things that play does. When kids decide what game to play, decide what the rules be, get into conflicts, and work out the conflicts, what happens? They develop their intrinsic interest, learn how to make decisions, solve problems, regulate emotions, make friends, and it sure is fun. They have a lot of joy and pleasure. One of the most important things you learn in unsupervised play is how to take intelligent risks. And you see this when kids learn how to, say, skateboard. They don't just skateboard safely, they then start going down the stairs because they want just the right amount of risk. That's how they grow. It's built into them to take risks, to get stronger, to get smarter, to extend their capabilities. So an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, should we allow kids to play with saws and knives? Alison Gopnik argues, well, actually, maybe yes. And so she says, trying to eliminate all risks from kids' lives, we want to do that, but it's a really bad idea. And she says it may be like the hygiene hypothesis, which is what I just told you about peanuts. It may be that kids need risk just as they need dirt and germs to develop their immune system. Then she says, in the same way, by shielding children from every possible risk, we may lead them to react with exaggerated fear to situations that aren't risky at all, like 2 feminists coming to your campus to have a debate that you don't have to go to. That is actually not risky at all. But if you have not been able to develop your understanding of risk, you might perceive it as risky. And in this way, we isolate young people from the adult skills that they will one day have to master. So I'm not saying that we need this much risk, because Nietzsche did not say that what kills you makes you stronger. There's definite evidence against that. So we don't want situations where kids can physically die. What we want, I think, are playgrounds like this where you can get hurt. It's very, very important that kids can get hurt on playgrounds, because if they can get hurt, then every day they learn how to not get hurt. But if we take that away from them, if we give them only playgrounds like this, which is what my kids grew up on, then they don't learn anything. It's just not that much fun because there's not enough risk. The basic dictum of child rearing should be prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. In Britain, they're ahead of us by a couple of years. They have all the same problems, but they've wisened up to this. A couple of years ago, they realized, with their rising rates of depression and anxiety, they've realized we've got to give kids more risk. Now, they have many fewer lawyers than we do, so they can actually do it. So they've started putting construction materials out on playgrounds and let the kids play with it. And yes, you can hurt your fingers on the bricks, but look what this kid is learning. He is discovering independently Archimedes' principle of the lever. And he is going to jump on that board, and the bricks are going to fly up and teach him a lesson he will always remember, unless he has amnesia. In America, where we have too many lawyers, we do the opposite. If anyone gets hurt using a consumer product, we want to ban the consumer product. And yes, college students sometimes play with super soakers and snowballs. And yes, they sometimes get hurt. The American impulse is, well, let's ban super soakers and snowballs. And I really want to emphasize, we talk a lot in the book about safety and safetyism, the worship of safety. We don't mean physical safety. The students nowadays, or Gen Z, often talks about emotional safety. And so here's a meme that I found online. We are all balloons filled with feelings in a world full of pins. Okay, now we can understand what that means, but do you really want to teach your kids that they are balloons full of feelings? Do you really want to teach them that the world is full of pins? What a way to cripple them. What a way to make them fearful. Taleb has wonderful advice. It's a really great book. And he points out that a candle flame is fragile. And so if you have a candle flame, you need to put like a hurricane lamp, a glass tube around it to protect it from wind. But a fire, once it reaches a certain size, a fire, the more you blow on it, the stronger it gets. And so Taleb says you want to be the fire and wish for the wind. That's what a college experience should be all about. Now, so this is the first grade on truth. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That is wrong. I want to now go into this issue of rising anxiety and depression, which I think is related to what I just showed you. So it's really important for everybody to understand that there was a change of generations with birth year 1996, plus or minus a couple years. Kids born in 1996 are very different from the millennials. And so this is nationally representative data on how teenagers use their time. And what's been found is that the percentage of 12th graders who have a driver's license has been declining. This began with the millennials, but it's accelerating with Gen Z. The percentage who have ever had a drink is declining, which you might think is a good thing from a safety point of view, but it's related to a broader pattern of simply not having adult experiences. For example, the percent that have ever gone out on a date or had any sort of romantic interaction, plummeting. The percentage who have ever worked for pay, plummeting. Now, we used to expect when a student shows up on campus, they have learned to drive, have had some interaction, some romantic or sexual interaction. They've at least tried alcohol once, and they've maybe worked. And that's not generally true anymore. Students, in fact, Jean Twenge, who organized this data, says 18-year-olds today have the life experience of a 15-year-old from 30 or 40 years ago. And so we should really rethink, should we be sending 18-year-olds from high school to college? In the book, Greg and I recommend everybody should take a gap year. The whole country would be so much better off if students left home, worked. If you take kids from red zones of the country, have them work in a blue zone or vice versa, boy, would that do a lot for democracy, for the kids, and for universities. So Gen Z is having a lot less experience. What are they doing instead? With all this time saved, instead of drinking and dating and driving and working, what are they doing? They're on their phones. Now, you can see the difference between Gen Z and the millennials in this graph. This is, again, nationally representative data on college students. And what you see is that in 2010 and 2012, all students on campus were millennials. And those were their rates of those issues. Over the next 4 years, they're replaced by Gen Z. So today, almost all students, unless they're late returners, are Gen Z. And look what happens. Most things are only up a little, but psychological disorders are up a lot. They've tripled. The rate has tripled. And you heard Chancellor Reddy talk about that. This is the top concern for university presidents across the country, mental health. But it's not all psychological disorders. It's only two: depression and anxiety. That's it, nothing else. Not schizophrenia, not bipolar disorder, not even substance use. Depression and anxiety. So this is, again, national data. What happens? The rates are steady for major depression. Girls have higher rates than boys. That's always been the case. At puberty, the gap opens up. But as soon as Gen Z comes into the picture, the rate for boys goes up, but the rate for girls goes way up. And this is the pattern you'll see over and over again in the next few slides. College student data, different data source. Again, millennials are stable rates, but when Gen Z comes to campus, males are up, females are way up. So we've all been talking about this for the last few years, and there are some skeptics. So Dr. Richard Friedman, writing in the New York Times, says, oh, come on, it's not real. It's just a moral panic. In fact, Gen Z is just more open. They're really good at talking about their feelings, at admitting that they're depressed. This is a good thing, that they're so honest. So those graphs, that's just self-report data. It's nothing to be worried. It's not a real epidemic. I believe he's wrong, and I can show you the data in two graphs. So this is, let's look at behavior, not self-report, behavior. Now, there's nothing to see in this graph. This is the boys. This is the rate, this is the number out of 100,000 teenage boys who are admitted to the hospital every year because they cut themselves or otherwise harmed themselves to the point where they had to be hospitalized. And what you see is that the rates are around 200, 250 per 100,000, and that there's no change at all, flat line, from 2001 to 2015. Okay? Now let's look at the girls. First thing to notice is that the rates are a lot higher. And that's always been the case. Again, girls have more internalizing disorders. That is, girls have more rates of diseases that make themselves miserable. Boys have higher rates of what are called externalizing disorders, where they make other people miserable. So it's alcoholism, drug use, crime, violence. Okay, so there are big sex differences, but what we're talking about here is especially hitting the girls. But no real trend up to 2009. What happens after 2009 is this. So the older teen girls, their rate is up 62%. This is not a small increase. This is a gigantic increase in hospital admissions. This is not self-report. This is hard data. Most stunningly, look at the young girls. Look at the 10 to 14-year-olds. Their rate has nearly tripled. 189% increase in just a few years. It's important to note that the oldest, these young women here, these are millennials. If you were 20 in 2015, you're not Gen Z, you're millennial. So whatever was happening in this period wasn't affecting the millennials. It was only affecting Gen Z. What could it be? Well, it's not just self-harm, it's also suicide. So the suicide rate, so boys have higher rates of completed suicides. They tend to use irreversible methods, guns and tall buildings. And they have higher rates. That's a cause for concern, but it's not a change. What changed around 2010, 2011 is that the boys' rate went up, but actually about the same as older men. The girls' rates, however, went way up, much more than older women. So for preteens, the rates have risen to the highest level they've ever been, and they've risen spectacularly quickly. So 10 to 14-year-old boys, these are the rates going back to the 70s. During the crime wave, there was lead poisoning, there was more violence. But in modern times, so the millennials are in this section here. Once Gen Z comes into the picture, the rate for boys goes up, but the increase for girls is, as a percentage, much, much larger. In fact, it's a 150% increase. in the rate of suicide for 10 to 14-year-old girls. So this is not self-report, this is actual completed suicides. So yes, we have an epidemic of depression and anxiety and self-harm and suicide. It began around 2010, 2011, and it's not just in the United States. So at every university, there's a flood of demand. We can't hire therapists fast enough to meet the demand. Oh, this is interesting. At Penn State, they have an office that surveys mental health clinics from all over the country at universities. What's happening? Why are students coming in into the clinic? Only depression and anxiety is rising. Now note, here's stress. Only 6% of students are coming in saying, I'm coming in because I'm very stressed. My point is, Gen Z is not actually more stressed than previous generations. I've seen this in several data sets. The difference is that we never gave Gen Z the chance to learn how to deal with ordinary, everyday stress. And so it shows up as anxiety and depression. I've been looking at other countries. I've traveled to a number of other countries talking about the book, and we see the same pattern in all of the English-speaking countries where I'm able to get good data and understand it. So in Britain, self-harm is up. The boys, again, up a little bit. Girls, up a lot. In Canada, same thing. Boys are up a little bit. Girls up a lot, especially in the higher age group. But again, as a percentage, this is the biggest percentage increase there, the younger teenage girls. In Australia and New Zealand, in Australia, the trend is not as sharp, but again, we see the same trend for mental illness, meaning depression in this case. In New Zealand is really interesting because it's the last English-speaking country that lets kids out to play. They play rugby. They have this idea that they say, take a concrete pill, toughen up. New Zealand they're much tougher than the rest of us. And I was hopeful that in New Zealand, things would be different. And they were. The trend is just starting in New Zealand. And as they say in New Zealand, every bad idea from America comes here 3 to 5 years later. So why is this happening? And what I'm telling you tonight, the case I'm trying to build, is that we weakened a whole generation because they're anti-fragile, but we treated them like they're fragile. So we weakened their defenses, we weakened their toughness, we made them more delicate. And then social media came in. For the same generation that was weakened, social media comes in just as they're reaching puberty. This, I think, is what explains the timing and the sex difference. And the fact that it's happening in multiple countries at the same time or with just a couple years delay. So I'm writing an essay now for The Atlantic with Tobias Rose Stockwell, who understands social media from the inside. I don't. And what I've learned is that social media was actually a pretty nice place in its early years. There was Friendster, there was MySpace, there was the Facebook, as it was originally called. And these were just glorified address books that let you link to your friends and display a few things about yourself. They were pretty nice. But things really, really changed between 2009 and 2012, so check it out. In 2006, Facebook opens to the world, so now anybody can lie and say they're 13 and get a Facebook account. But very few 10-year-olds do. In 2007, the iPhone comes out, but it's expensive, and very few 10, 11, 12-year-olds have one. By 2009, though, a lot more have them, and Facebook introduces the like button, which makes it much, much more addictive, because now everything you do is rated by others. And the like button allows Gen Z to become like B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, training pigeons by giving them little tiny bits of reward for the desired behavior. So Gen Z hyperconnects to each other so that they all become psychologists training each other, and they all become pigeons being trained by each other. So this is, I think, a transformative moment, 2009, when social media becomes much more addictive and much more behavior shaping. Twitter adds the retweet button, Facebook copies that with the share, and now outrage can spread, things can spread and go viral much more quickly. So between 2009 and 2012 is the key period when social media changes, becomes much better at fomenting outrage, much better at addicting people, sucking them in and keeping them on. And this is the 2-year period when American teenagers go from mostly not online to mostly online. Online, I mean on social media daily use. So before this, kids would often go over to each other's houses, and they would talk face to face, and they would do things together. After this, they mostly go home, sit on their bed, and interact via their phone. And this might have been great. We might have thought, and I thought, maybe this will make them super social if they have all this social interaction. But that doesn't seem to be what happened. Instead, what happened is this. This is the period when it all changes, and right then is when the mental illness, the depression rates take off. Social media also perfectly explains the sex difference. Why are boys doing a little worse, but girls in every country that I've looked at are doing much worse? First, the boys are mostly playing video games. And it turns out video games aren't that bad. They can push out everything else. The kids can become, pasty and vitamin D deficient, but it doesn't do the bad things that we thought. It doesn't make them crazy killers. Social media, though, is worse than we thought, I believe. So girls use social media more. Girls are more affected by constant social comparison. That's always been the case. And it used to be that it was the models in the magazines that were airbrushed. When I was growing up, there was a lot of talk about that. It's bad to expose teenage girls to these fake beauty standards that are impossible to reach. Well, guess what? It's no longer models in magazines. It's now all of your friends. So my niece showed me how she took a photo of herself. She pressed a single filter button on Instagram, and her face got narrower, her eyes got bigger, and her skin got perfectly smooth. So she was suddenly much more beautiful. So imagine look, 7th and 8th grade are the worst years of everybody's life, right? Imagine making it 10 times worse by stepping up the social comparison and suddenly everyone's more beautiful than you. This is terrible for girls. Girls are more affected than boys by the fear of missing out and fear of being left out. And lastly, girls and boys are equally aggressive. Aggression is part of human nature, as is cooperation. But boys' aggression is physical. They physically threaten each other. And so on weekends, they can't be bullied. And when they're all playing video games, they can't be bullied. So boys' bullying was not made worse by the arrival of smartphones. But girls' aggression has always been relational. They damage each other's relationships or reputation. And now they can do it 24 hours a day, including weekends. You can never escape, and you don't even know who's doing it because they can create anonymous accounts. So this has been a disaster for girls and a boon to the mean girls who are experts in bullying. I have a lot more on this. If you want to dig deeper, go to thecoddling.com and then click on the Solutions in Better Mental Health. There's a lot more research there you can dig into. Okay, so that was the longest one. The other two will be shorter. But what doesn't kill you makes you weaker is just wrong. Kids are anti-fragile. We've treated them like they're fragile. We've denied them experience in the real world, but we said, go ahead and have as much experience in the online world as you want. We have no idea what will happen. It's a giant national experiment. Let's just hope for the best. And that's what happened. Bad idea number 2, very briefly, is wrong. The truth is that we are all prone to emotional reasoning and the confirmation bias. And this is the central idea of the Stoics and of Buddhism and of many other wisdom traditions. So Epictetus said, it is not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of their significance. And this is basically the insight of CBT. Something happens in the world. Did it hurt you? Well, if you think it's the end of the world, then it does hurt you. If you catastrophize, then it does hurt you. So Buddha said, your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts unguarded. But once mastered, as you learn to do in CBT, once mastered, no one can help you as much, not even your father or your mother. Aaron Beck, one of the founders of CBT, basically developed a method of teaching people to question their feelings. You feel left out. You feel sad. Did somebody really insult you? Did they mean to exclude you? Let's look at the evidence. And it turns out often you're wrong. And so CBT is basically ancient wisdom turned into a therapy. You learn how to catch yourself catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, dichotomous thinking, all those things. In college, I'm going to shorten this one for time. I want to keep the talk to an hour. I have a lot to tell you. So I'm going to skip this one, except to say that in college, a lot of the innovations that we've done since 2015, often because the students have been demanding them, and teach students to do this, to embrace this untruth. We teach them magnification when we teach them to find microaggressions in ordinary conversation. We teach them emotional reasoning, we teach them literally, that it's not intent that matters, it's impact. That's a thing that the students sometimes say. And so if you feel offended by something, then you were attacked, and then the attacker therefore needs to be punished by an adult. We do fortune telling. Students are rarely asking for trigger warning for themselves. They're usually saying, we need a trigger warning because some people will be traumatized by this book. That's fortune telling. Very few people are traumatized by a book. So I'm going to, again, shorten this one, but this is chapter 2 of the book. And we'll move on to this one, bad idea number 3, which is incredibly important on college campuses and increasingly in the workplace. It's very important for you to understand what's happening and how we are coming apart with increasing demonization of each other across the political divide and many other divides. So this is a really bad idea, to teach students that life is a battle between good people and evil people. That is a recipe for constant conflict and for destroying cooperation. What's true is that we are all prone to dichotomous thinking and to tribalism. These are our default. These are easy. You don't have to teach people to do this. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it most brilliantly when he describes his time in the Soviet Union's gulags and their prison camps, when he could have been all moralistic and talked about how evil the regime was and what a victim he was. But he notices that he himself, with one slight different decision, he would have been a guard, not a prisoner. And so he points out that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. We're all capable of good and evil. We all do good, we all do evil. Combine that, and of course this insight is common to all the wisdom traditions. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but you do not notice the log in your own? We're all hypocrites. We're all good, we're all evil. We all need to be more morally humble. But instead, what do we teach students on campus? Oh, just to bring in also, in addition to our dichotomous thinking, we're all prone to tribalism. This Bedouin proverb captures the logic perfectly. I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and cousins against the world. We're really good at doing us versus them. Whatever the level of attack is, we organize and we fight them. So you put this all together and you get the culture of the call-out culture that has spread across campuses since 2014, 2015. So here's a great description of it from a student at Smith College in Massachusetts. She says, during my first days at Smith, I witnessed countless conversations that consisted of one person telling the other that their opinion was wrong. The word offensive was almost always included. Members of my freshman class quickly assimilated to this new way of non-thinking. They could detect a politically incorrect view and call the person out on their mistake. And I want you to think, those of your students here, I want you to think, do you see that here? And I have no idea what the answer is going to be. I imagine it's better than at Smith, but I don't know what we're going to find here. But she says, I began to voice my opinion less often to avoid being berated and judged by a community that claims to represent the free expression of ideas. I learned, along with every other student, to walk on eggshells for fear that I may say something offensive. That is the social norm here. So that's a very good description of call-out culture. It chills speech because people are afraid not of being punished by the officials, but of the social shaming, the calling out, the attack by fellow students. So my question, so if you are a current student at UCCS, please raise your hand high right now. Okay, so just you, okay, put your hands down now. Now my question is, 2 questions. The first is going to be, does this characterize the overall climate here at school? And then the second is, have you seen evidence of it in some places? So first, does this characterize the overall climate at the school? Raise your hand high if you'd say yes. Okay, great. Only about 3 people. Great. And raise your hand if you'd say no. Current students, raise your hand and say no. Okay, great. So you'll be very pleased to know that I did this demo at UC Boulder last night, and most of them said that actually they did see it at Boulder. So this is, you're doing much better than Boulder. I imagine there's some rivalry. Yeah, okay. Okay, but now my question is to current students, have you seen this in some parts of the university? Raise your hand if you'd say yes. Okay, now it seems to be most of you. And raise your hand if you'd say no, you've not seen any sign of this. Raise your hand high, 1, 2, 3, okay, about 8 or 10. All right, so this is common in many universities that it's here, but it hasn't taken over. You should thank your lucky stars that you're not going to Yale, Brown, Harvard, Middlebury, Boulder. Oh, I think this is actually being recorded and it's going to be put online, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. But, okay. Okay. So a call-out culture does not just affect the students, because we faculty are also afraid of the subset of students who do the calling out. And we are self-censoring like mad. I just spoke to some professors at a major Midwestern university. They teach cognitive psychology, and they said, we just don't even teach intelligence anymore. It's one of the major areas of cognitive psych, but they just won't even touch it because it's just too likely to make students mad. So faculty are self-censoring. We're often afraid of our students. Now, most of our students are wonderful, but in a class of 300, we have to teach to the most sensitive student, the one who will report us. And many universities have implemented a bias response team so that students can report us anonymously. Now, central to this new way of thinking, where you see offenses everywhere, is the notion of intersectionality. And I want to be very clear that, this is part of the culture war, and you can tell where people are, how they talk about political correctness and intersectionality. And most people are either on the left or the right, and they're all yelling at each other. I don't do that. I assume good intent, and I find good ideas everywhere. And this is a good idea. Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed the concept in the late 1980s, pointed out that we all have many identities, and your experience as a human being is not the sum of those identities. They interact and intersect in ways that produce new outcomes. So if you're a black woman in America, your experience is not just the sum of being black in America and being female. That there are unique indignities, obstacles, dangers, problems that affect African American women. And if you don't understand that, then you won't hear them. You won't see certain problems. So it's a great idea. And she has a TED Talk, which is excellent. I agree with everything she says in the TED Talk. But when you take this idea onto campus and you teach students to think about identities in this binary way, where there's like this. This is a diagram from the 1990s. You teach students to see that everyone exists at a certain point on these binary dimensions. Either you're white or you're non-white, and if you're white, you are privileged, and if you're non-white, you are oppressed. And either you're male or non-male, and if you're male, you're privileged. Now, these are not just descriptions of possible dimensions of identity paired with objective facts about equality, inequality. It's not just a description. This is a moral map, because the people above the line are oppressors. Therefore, they are morally bad. And the people below the line are victims, and therefore they are morally good. And so, as it's taught on campus, we actually teach students to see the world in terms of good people versus evil people, good groups versus evil groups, and constant conflict over a zero sum, a fixed pie. Life is a battle between groups over a fixed pie. Now, this diagram is from the 1990s, but just last week, a friend of mine sent me this. This is just to point out that the intersection of evil is the heterosexual white male. They are the cause of our problems. They are the locus of evil, is the lesson that follows from this. Now, just last week, or 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine sent me something that a student of his gave him. This is at an Ivy League school in the Northeast, and she went to a leadership training course. So this is how to be a leader, and they were teaching intersectionality. Let's zoom in. So what the students were taught are that you should look at society and you should see that there's a privileged group, which is cisgender men. They're the privileged group and the oppressors. And then there's an oppressed group. Everybody else is oppressed by the cisgender men. That's the way you should look at society. There are whites who are privileged, and then non-whites are oppressed by the whites. Go down to number 6. The privileged people are aged 28 to 52, and they oppress everybody who's younger than them or older than them. Now, this is an incredibly paranoid way to look at the world. Young people, you should see yourself as oppressed by people like me. Am I still in it? No, I'm not. Oh my God, I qualify for victim status now. So again, this idea is not disconnected from reality. There is privilege, there is oppression. But to teach young people to look at other human beings and say, not you're a human being, but oh, you're this, this, and this, therefore your moral score is -3. This is a terrible thing to teach people in a multi-ethnic, free society. And this leads to things like this. an essay written by a student in Texas about white death and how your DNA is an abomination. White death will mean liberation for all. Now, he didn't mean literally kill all white people. He just meant cultural death, that whiteness should be wiped out, white people's culture should be eliminated. So that's actually not nearly as bad. At the New School, a few blocks north of me in Manhattan, students, this is one of the most progressive, anti-racist, anti-fascist spaces you could possibly imagine. And at this bastion of very, very progressive thinking, the students created a safe space for everybody other than straight white people. Everyone else is welcome, no straight white people. Okay, again, this is not a good way to think in a multi-ethnic society. And it's not just on college. It's seeping out into the broader political discussion. So Harvey Weinstein is a monster who should be put in jail for the rest of his life. But a gender studies professor writes an article that gets published in the Washington Post that says, why can't we hate men collectively? We collectively have every right to hate you collectively. You collectively have done us collectively wrong. Okay, now it's not that there's no truth to that, but I'm a product of the 20th century where the big lesson that we learned and that I thought was our key to progress was, that thing where we judge people by their category and we hate them because of their category? How about if we do less of that? Okay? That was the 20th century, late 20th century, summed up in a single sentence in terms of our moral progress. Okay? I think that was a pretty good idea, and that's being reversed now. The New York Times hired Sarah Jeong, who had all these tweets about how much she hates white people. And it was a big brouhaha, and the Times stuck to its guns and they didn't fire her, which I think is actually the right decision, because I don't think we should just stop firing people for something they tweeted. We do need to just stop that. But the point is, she is now an editor at the New York Times who has this history of writing really nasty things about white people and white men. And guess who chimes in? Jessica Valenti. Now, she is the feminist who was arguing at Brown that America is a rape culture. So she chimes in with the most perfect restatement of Great Untruth number 3. Sarah Jeong is good, her haters are bad. Black and white thinking, good versus evil. And she even goes on to say, it's not difficult. This is obviously true. Here's the good news. Guess what? Black people don't all think alike. Women don't all think alike. Muslims don't all think alike, okay? And a lot of them are now beginning to push back and say, no, you don't speak for me. This is not a good way to go. And so the New York Times just ran this article. I'm a black feminist, and I think call-out culture is toxic. There are better ways of doing social justice work. There's been a raft of new books by non-white intellectuals and professors arguing that we need to rethink identity politics. And what Greg and I do in our book is we say, common enemy identity politics is terrible. It's divisive, it's bad for the very people doing it, it just leads to constant conflict, it's the wrong thing to do if you want to create a welcoming, inclusive society. But common humanity identity politics works. It's not that identity politics is bad. Groups need a way to speak up for their interests. So you never would want to ban identity politics while leaving in place every other kind of politics. But if you do it by starting from a position of love or inclusion or common humanity, then it actually works. It's better for the people who do it. So and it's the only way forward if you want to create a diverse, welcoming society. So Pauli Murray was a woman who was she was a gay, or possibly we might now say trans, woman who was ordained as an Episcopal minister and then got a law degree from Yale. A new residential college is named for her. And she wrote in 1946, well before Martin Luther King came on the scene, I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. So you still need political activity, but if you do it within a framework of love and inclusion, it actually works. The Dalai Lama tweeted this last year. I'm Tibetan, I'm Buddhist, and I'm the Dalai Lama, but if I emphasize these differences, it sets me apart and raises barriers. What we need to do is pay more attention to the ways in which we are the same as other people. So this is identity politics, but done in a common humanity way. This is the way that the great civil rights leaders did. Now, obviously, there were many schools of thought, but the one that ultimately won the day, I think, was King's Way. And when I did the civil rights tour in Montgomery and Birmingham and learned that after the church was bombed in Birmingham, I believe it was King who said, some of our white brothers and sisters have made a mistake. So he refused to demonize. He was relentlessly humanizing. And guess what? This actually works. This kind of approach, especially if your opponent is very strong, actually can be more effective. So what I'd like you to imagine is that just suppose there was a university that was founded on the 3 great untruths. Imagine that when students come in, they're told, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, so we'll protect you. Always trust your feelings, don't question them. And life is a battle between good people and evil people, and we'll teach you to tell who is who. Imagine what it'd be like to go to a university like that. Conversely, imagine a university that taught you instead, we're going to prepare you for the road. We're not going to change the road here for you. We're going to prepare you to actually graduate and be successful. And we're going to teach you, you know what? You've got to learn critical thinking. If you feel something, look for evidence. Question it. You might be wrong. And if we taught you that, you know what? Life is really morally complicated. And that's what we're going to talk about when we read great literature. It's really complicated. And don't just go with your first judgment. And so when I Googled UCCS, I think it was actually kind of revealing that the first picture that came up was this like rainbow, and you say, let your light shine, or whatever was in your motto. So I thought that worked out pretty well. All right, so now to wrap up, I want to now, I hope I've laid out what the problems are on campus and why they're spreading. Just in the last few minutes, I'm going to go through what can we do. So, raise your hand if you are a parent whose kids are younger than 16. Raise your hand high. Okay, so I'm speaking to all of you. Please, when you go home, please go to letgrow.org. It was started by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. She's brilliant, she's funny. I co-founded it with her, I'm on the board, but she really runs it. All kinds of ideas for how you can give your kids more freedom, build on their innate anti-fragility. Second, to all of you who are parents or who will have kids soon, here are 3 simple rules to solve what is the most pervasive problem. It's the thing that all parents talk about when they're together. It's really getting annoying and boring, but here are 3 rules that can actually really help. This is what I do in my home. First, all screens out of the bedroom by a set time. There's no reason why teenagers should have any kind of screen in their phone or in their bedroom overnight, because some actually leave the alerts on, and even if they don't, when we wake up in the night, we all wake up in the night at times and just go right back to bed. But if your phone is there, some will check it and check it and check it and have anxiety and not go back to sleep. And that's just bad all around. Second, no social media until high school. Your kids are going to say, but Mom, everyone else is on it. And that's unfortunately true. But what I'm working to do is get it known that this is just so bad for junior high school kids, and especially elementary kids. We need to make a concerted effort as a society to just keep it out of middle school and younger. High school, we're not going to be able to keep it out of, but don't let kids have it until they're in high school. And third, agree on a time budget. You don't want to be monitoring your kids all the time. Are you on your phone again? What are you doing? What are you doing? No, I'm doing language training. It's okay, Mom. Oh, okay. You don't want that kind of constant monitoring. So set a time budget with your kids, and Gen Z is actually quite reasonable. They understand the difficulties here, and they often are very reasonable in saying, they're not going to say, oh, I want 6 hours a day. They'll often say, well, no, yeah, I do spend too much time on the phone. How about 2 or 3, 3 hours, some number, but work it out with them. And then you can use the screen time controls or other things that are very, very effective. Third, I urge you, anybody with any political connections in this state, are there any state legislators here, or does anybody know a state legislator? Raise your hand. Okay, good. There's several of you. Please contact the state legislator you know and urge them to pass a free-range parenting bill in Colorado. Utah has led the way. Utah is showing you up. Colorado is vastly inferior until you match them by passing. And what it does, in Utah, they passed a law that specifically says that giving kids freedom, that letting kids go outside is not automatically neglect. Which means that if your kids go play in a park, you can't be arrested unless you also abuse your kids. But if you just let them play in a park when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, you can't be arrested for that. And that gives parents the confidence to actually send their kids out to learn things. I want to emphasize that the current regime in which we're all terrified that that a neighbor's going to call and report us if our kids are spotted in the wild is hardest for poor single mothers. Married middle-class families can afford childcare, they can shift off, they can constantly supervise the child, never leave him unguarded. But if you're a single mother with an 8-year-old kid, why can't the kid walk home from the bus stop? Why do you have to come home from work or hire a babysitter for an 8 or 9-year-old kid when you yourself, all of us, spent time alone when we were 7 and 8? Anyway, please pass a free-range law here in Colorado. There's already talk about it, so talk to your legislators about this. Second, how many of you here are professors or administrators at the university level? Please raise your hand high. Okay, great, about 15 or so of you. I urge you, if you run any organization, this applies too, talk constantly about anti-fragility, and that will justify all the other policies that you might do that will actually make students stronger. So Ruth Simmons, first African-American president of an Ivy League school, said, "Learning is the antithesis of comfort. The collision of views and ideologies is in the DNA of the academic enterprise. We do not need any collision avoidance technology here." And that allowed her, when students demanded that she shut down a speech by, I think it was David Horowitz, she said no. In fact, she went to the talk to demonstrate, you know what? You can learn from this. You can get stronger. Especially college administrators, everybody is facing this mental health crisis. Why not teach CBT to incoming freshmen? It won't just help those with depression, anxiety, it gives them a vocabulary for critical thinking. It helps everybody. And third, if you run any sort of organization, please consider using Open Mind. It's a program I developed with my colleagues. It uses basic research in moral psychology. It walks students through 5 steps: cultivate moral humility, learn some psychology, why we do confirmation bias, why you will benefit from having people disconfirm your ideas, how do you start a conversation, and we have evidence that it works. I won't go into this, but it's free online. Get a link, send it out to your employees, members of your congregation, the PTA, whatever it is, any group that is experiencing political conflict. If you all do this together, things should get a lot better. Finally, everybody who raised their hand before, I invite you all to join Heterodox Academy. Josh was one of the first 10 members of it. We're a totally nonpartisan group. We're evenly balanced on the political spectrum. We love universities. We're not trying to help any party. We're trying to help universities by saying we need to actively work to safeguard and increase viewpoint diversity. So please, if you're a professor, just join. It's free. You can quit anytime. Finally, those of you who are Gen Z students, the several dozen of you, or 50 or whatever it was who raised your hand, speaking to you, grown-ups all around you have been making assumptions about you from the time you were little. They've been assuming you're fragile, and most of you are not fragile. And if you don't make your voices known, if you don't ask for them to back off, to let you learn from mistakes, to stop overprotecting you, they're not going to do it. So now that you've heard this talk, or if you've read the book, you have a language for saying, back off. We can handle this. We'll help each other. We'll work it out ourselves. If you want a cause to advocate for, I would say advocate for helping the next generation behind you to not have the levels of anxiety and depression that you have. Especially if you care about girls and women's issues, this is incredibly important. And finally, to all of you who are Gen Z and also millennials, anybody who's still relatively young, I urge you to embrace anti-fragility, and here is a great way to end the talk. The best statement on anti-fragility ever was given by Van Jones. He's a Democratic activist. He was in the Obama administration. He's a very progressive, politically left activist who actively seeks out engagement with Republicans and conservatives, who is civil, forceful but civil. He's a great example for us in our time of polarization. He was interviewed by David Axelrod, who runs the Institute for Politics at the University of Chicago. And I'll just play you about 2 minutes of it. Okay.
Look, yours.
Okay, wait a second. Let me just pause this. Okay. So there had just been, it wasn't quite a shout down. A member of the Trump administration was going to speak on campus, and some students were protesting. They were going to shout it down. I don't remember what happened. But right after that, Van Jones is a guest on David Axelrod's podcast or show. And Axelrod says, we just had this episode. What do you think about it, Van? And listen to his response.
have a different view, but I'm interested in yours.
Look, I don't like bigots and bullies. I just want to point that out. I'm against bigots, I'm against bullies. So just leave that as it is.
Those who like bigots and bullies, raise your...
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to say I got tough talk for my liberal colleagues on these campuses. And they don't tend to like it, but they tend to like me, so I can get away with it. So I'm going to keep trying to push.
Let's test the proposition.
Exactly. I want to push this. There are two ideas about safe spaces. One is a very good idea, and one is a terrible idea. The idea of being physically safe on a campus, not being subjected to sexual harassment and physical abuse or something like that, or being targeted specifically personally for some kind of hate speech, you are an N-word or whatever, that hey, perfectly fine with that. Perfectly fine with that. But there's another view that is now, I think, ascendant, which I think is just a horrible view, which is that I need to be safe ideologically. I need to be safe emotionally. I just need to feel good all the time. And if someone says something that I don't like, that is a problem for everybody else, including the administration. And I think that is a terrible idea for the following reason. I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym. You can't live on a campus where people say stuff you don't like, and these people can't fire you. They can't arrest you. They can't beat you up. They can just say stuff you don't like, and you get to say stuff back. And this you cannot bear.
Yeah. Now, I've watched that now 50 times, and I want to applaud every time I see it too. So especially to Gen Z students and to everybody who has any authority over the environments in which Gen Z is raised and educated, hope you'll take that to heart. And so I close with this final piece of advice from, more or less, from Taleb, which is that you are the fire. So now go find some wind. So thank you.